All right, class dismissed. Chapter 26, Samantha. Well, this is the last time I'm doing a good deed, that's for sure. Now I know why I never do them. What a disaster of a day. This morning, Mr. Wolcott waited for me outside the big house for Old Geezers. That's a name that makes me smile. Wearing a bright pink bow tie with a monocle in his eye. Call me Mr. Chips, he said in a loud British accent. All things considered, the name could have been worse. I told him he was doing my class a big favor. I was grateful, sincerely. When I got to school and introduced Mr. Chips, the other kids were really impressed that I had saved the day. Giovanna said that I was fantastically awesome, and that made me feel even more fantastically awesome. But then he kept on quoting things like he always does. You're supposed to be a teacher, I reminded him. And what life lessons we learn from the great bard Shakespeare himself, said Mr. Chips, who then added, we know what we are, but we know not what we may be. Okay, I said, biting my lip. But even with him quoting things like usual, we arrived at the museum and everything was going well. Mr. Wolcott had been in a wonderful mood. He probably didn't go away on trips from the big house for Old Geezers, my name for the day, very often. We had been in a museum for about an hour, and were in the Native American exhibit admiring the moccasins. I was trying to explain to Giovanna why shoes are the most important fashion accessory, and how color coordination was not optional. I think I was finally starting to get through to her, but then my shoulder was tapped. I think something's wrong with Mr. Chips, said Eric. Who? I asked. Mr. Chips, our pretend teacher. I thought he was next to me, but I had been keeping Mr. Wolcott by my side all morning. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands balled into fists. He was breathing heavily. I quickly walked over to him. Are you okay, Mr. Chips? Him? Mr. Wolcott pointed to a tall, scrawny security guard against the far wall. The guard was an old guy, in his 60s at least. Do you need help? Maybe Mr. Wolcott had some sort of emergency and needed to alert the authorities for assistance. What can I do? I asked, genuinely concerned. Maybe we need to find him a doctor. That man is Geoffrey Barrows, Mr. Wolcott announced, still staring at the guard. My arch enemy. The guard yawned. He didn't even notice Mr. Wolcott pointing at him with a long, crooked finger or the angry glare in our chaperone's eyes. That's just a security guard, I said. The scrawny old guy across the room didn't look like he could hurt a fly. Still, Mr. Wolcott seemed pretty worked up. I could recognize him anywhere, Mr. Wolcott declared. His nostrils flared. He took a step forward towards the guard. I stepped in the path of Mr. Wolcott to block his way. He tried to sidestep me, but I moved in front of him again. Let me pass, he demanded. I think you might be mistaken, Mr. Chips. I hoped if I said his teacher name, it might remind him he was supposed to be acting, and that teachers didn't start fights with security guards. But I don't think he even heard me. His stare never left the guard. A few people were watching us now. I turned my back to them. Have I told you about the love of my life, Franny Bree? He asked. I assured him that I might have heard that name once or twice. It was 50 years ago. Franny and I were set to perform on a London stage. It would have been a grand performance of Romeo and Juliet. We would tour Europe, playing with star-crossed lovers, if not for him. His nostrils flared, his heels bounced, his face was tomato red. Mr. Wolcott was always so sweet on his lawn chair. I had never seen this side of him. I planned to propose marriage, he proclaimed. Our happiness was assured, but the night before we were set to leave, I fell ill. Barra went to London in my place, and he stole her heart. I never saw Franny again. I'm so sorry. I pictured Mr. Wolcott sitting in his lawn chair when I came home from school every day. I'd never seen him with his friends or family. Do you have any? Maybe he'd spent his whole life regretting his lost love. But you can't blame someone else that you got sick. The cat poisoned me, shouted Mr. Wolcott. True, I cannot prove it, but I know it with every fiber of my soul. He wanted me out of the way so he could take my Franny from me. He averted his gaze from the guard and looked down at me. I had never seen his eyes so sad. I wanted to give him a big hug, but that would have been totally weird. Mr. Wolcott looked away for a moment, wiping a tear from his eye. But then he turned back around. His expression of despair was gone, and once again replaced with anger. His body seemed to vibrate with rage. He stared at the guard and shook his fist. Revenge will be mine!